Washington Journal continues.
We're back, and we're going to continue the conversation about political polarization and how we can solve it in this country. We're joined by two distinguished experts. We're joined by Peter Coleman, who's the author of The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, and with Pearce Godwin, the founder and CEO of Listen First, the Listen First Project. Gentlemen, good morning.
Morning,
good morning
Jesse.
to you.
All right, so Peter, I'll start with you with this question. How did you become first interested in tackling the issue of political polarization?
I'm a professor at Columbia. I'm a researcher that studies conflict, particularly difficult long-term conflicts. And so as I've watched political rhetoric get more and more ugly in this country over the last decade or so, I became increasingly concerned. And so even though we had studied conflicts, for example, in Israel-Palestine or other long-term conflicts, it seemed to me to make sense to take a serious look at what's happening here, because this conflict the political divisions that we're suffering from today have been increasingly worse since the late 1970s. So this is a long-term pattern, a long-term problem. I study those things, so I got serious about paying attention to them, trying to study them systematically, and trying to offer insights about what to do.
And Pearce, how did you first become interested in this topic? And tell us a little bit about the Listen First Project.
Sure thing. Yeah, I spent the first half in 2013 of what we might consider an extreme example of what Peter and I are encouraging all of our fellow Americans to do, stepping outside of our comfort zone and spending time with people unlike ourselves. For me, that was over in Uganda, Africa, with a Christian International Relief Organization. And after that experience, in which I, of course, witnessed some abject material poverty, but this incredible relational wealth, despite those material circumstances, I looked at what I'd be coming home to. Was on an overnight bus ride going to see all the awesome animals in that part of the world and thought, wait a second, based on the headlines I'm seeing from back home, I'm coming back to the most materially prosperous nation on the planet and finding abject relational poverty. Folks at each other's throat, vitriol at a fever pitch. This isn't right. Jotted down those thoughts, put them up on the internet, and next thing I know, the message was in papers all over America called It's Time to Listen. But the key to the work I'm doing now today is that I realized this wicked problem of toxic polarization is far too big for any one organization to tackle. And I was so encouraged a couple years later to realize that I wasn't alone, that there are already a number of organizations out there doing this work. Village Square down in Tallahassee, Florida, Living Room Conversations, and the National Institute for Civil Discourse. So I thought, hey, what if we could have a greater impact together? And that's when we founded the Listen First Coalition with those four. And today there are over 500 organizations in the Listen First Coalition, folks in their own way across America, bringing people together across differences to listen, to understand each other, to find some common ground, and to work together to fix things they broadly agree are broken. Because Jesse, the bottom line is that Americans are tired of division and dysfunction. We want peace in our families, calm in our communities, unity in our country, and solutions to problems. And the good news that I want your viewers to be encouraged by today is that even as this personal pain and national fear that's caused by the toxic polarization increases, so too is that movement around bridging divides. There's hope and there's opportunity with these hundreds of efforts bringing folks together to turn down the heat and find a way forward.
And Pearce, I'll stick with you for this. Can you tell our viewers what the National Week of Conversation is about?
Absolutely. You know, the National Week of Conversation was the first thing that this coalition did together. It happened for the first time in April of 2018 and continues year after year as a showcase and a moment for inspiration and awareness that there is this hope and opportunity. So every year, all of the 500 plus organizations who are doing this work do what they do in that week. And we make a lot of noise about it and try to let more Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs know that there is a step to take towards that way out that Peter talks about. 2024, it'll be April 15th through 21st. And again, every year, a galvanizing moment for us to focus a little bit more on each other, a little bit more on the future of the country, and also building partnerships across social sectors who are all so desperately and terribly impacted by this toxic polarization.
Now, Peter, Pearce was talking about how he saw America in the media when he was overseas. Peter, right now, how do you assess the current political climate in the United States in August 2023?
I think it's a dangerous time. I think that if you look at how irate many progressives are because of many of the recent rulings by the Supreme Court, if you look at how irate many Trump supporters are because of the multiple indictments that he's facing, and the story behind that, you know, the narrative around that, which is that it's a weaponized justice system. I think what this does is it creates a higher probability of violence. And we see this as something they call stochastic terrorism. When you have such anger in the media and even just in homes, it increases the chances that people with weapons and people with rage and maybe people that are less stable than others are going to become violent. And so I'm very worried about this. You know, I don't see major ruptures to the patterns that we've seen in the past around election cycles. And, you know, the election is a high stakes, high risk time. And so people go all in for their candidate or against the other candidate. And I'm very worried about political violence, you know, and I'm not alone. There was a poll on the New York Times yesterday about the percentage of Americans that feel that really our nation is on the brink of failure. I mean, we were downgraded as a democracy from a full democracy to a flawed democracy a couple of years back by the economics unit of The Economist. We're now feeling that at home. We're feeling that in our communities, that there is this flaw in the basic structure of how we live our lives, how we view the other, the news we watch. You know, unfortunately, as Pearce said, it's a wicked problem, which means it's not just, you know, me and my attitudes or our relationship or lack of relationship with people, but it scales and it affects, you know, where we travel, where we don't travel, who we talk to in our life, who we don't, the media we watch, the internets that, websites that we frequent. It's a pervasive problem in our life. And the evidence is bad. The trends that we've been tracking for decades are particularly bad, some of them at a historic level of enmity and hate for the other. And that's a recipe for, again, terrible political violence like we saw on January 6th. So that's my concern, is that we're moving into this fall with all of these forces combining together to really pit us against each other and pull us apart. And, I'm concerned that whether or not the middle can hold.
Pearce, do you agree?
I do agree. We see that 30% of partisans say losing the presidential election, quote, would have grave consequences for their well-being. That kind of existential fear and threat does not bring out the best in any of us. 62% of voters fear election-related violence in 2024, just as Peter and I do. And Peter made a point that my partner Nealon Parker at Common Ground USA often reminds me of, that there is this cyclical nature to the risk of political violence, which spikes around presidential elections. So therefore, this work, what we're talking about right now, is most critical at this time when counter-messaging is at its height, and the peaceful transition or continuation of power is necessary if we're going to keep this great experiment going.
Let me take 2 seconds here to remind our viewers that they can take part in this conversation. We're going to open up our regular lines for this conversation, which means Republicans, you can call in at 202-748-8001. Democrats, your lines 202-748-8000. Independents, we can hear from you at 202-748-8002. Remember, you can always text at 202-748-8003, and we're always reading on social media, on X at C-SPAN WJ, or on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN. Now, Peter, your book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization came out in 2021 after the aftermath of the bitter election of 2020, racial strife, and the COVID pandemic. Where are we now? Since we're not in the middle of the pandemic anymore, even though COVID is going back up, I want to remind people to keep themselves safe. But where are we now compared to where we were when you wrote your book?
Well, again, because we're now entering another election cycle, the levels of risk are very high. But I do want to stress that there is hope and there's good news, and that's what Pearce was alluding to. A lot of the Listen First Coalition. There's a group called the Bridging Divides Initiative, which is out of Princeton, and they have a website. And if you go to it, there's a map of the United States. And they've mapped something at this point like 8,000 community-based organizations around the country that are trying to bring people together across a variety of divides and have, conversations where they humanize each other. They get to experience each other, some of them in an ongoing way. And so, the Listen First Coalition, the Bridge Alliance, which is another organization that brings together a lot of these organizations, and these community-based groups, they show us that there are people across this country that are doing everything they can to come together to reach out to people that, they may feel are their enemy, but they sit down with them and realize that they're our neighbors, right? And I think that that's where I see hope. There are many stories of excellent initiatives like this happening at the community level, as well as in Congress. I want to give a shout out. A colleague of mine, Amanda Ripley, wrote a piece which profiled a committee in Congress called the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. It was a 2-year initiative that they did in Congress, and it was red and blue, Congress people who came together for 2 years and did really important and effective work on trying to change the culture within Congress. So there are these promising initiatives everywhere in different industries, in business, in organizations, in business organizations, community-based organizations. And, in the epicenter of the January 6th terror, you have these Congress people right on the heels of that come together and work together effectively to really start to transform the culture in Congress. These are hopeful stories. They're happening all over the country. That's the good news. But we need your listeners to join this movement. That we need everyone that is exhausted and fed up with the status quo to join us in sort of reaching out to people who are different from us, ideally through organizations that know how to shepherd those conversations constructively. Go to the Bridging Divides website, Bridging Divides Initiative website, and find the groups in your area that are doing this. They're all over the country.
Pearce, I will aim this question at you from one of our social media followers. They say, your guests have noble, if unrealistic, intentions. The problem is there are some types with whom you can never come to an understanding, compromise, collaboration, or agreement. And they go on to list some groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, but they also include the MAGA movement. And they say they would rather end you than talk to you. You live their way or you don't live. How do you deal with people, first of all, who don't want to agree with anyone, or people who think the other side doesn't want to agree with anything that they say? How do we get around this?
Great question, and one I hear often. The last thing you touched on there, Jesse, is something that is called meta-misperceptions. So it's kind of a double whammy. Not only do we have misperceptions of each other and that scary other side, but we also have misperceptions about how they perceive us. So if I am convinced that these people are not only crazy, but they hate me and they're out to get me and destroy everything that I hold dear, well, you better believe that I'm going to get even more stringently and stridently into my corner and fight back and lash out and not lean on those better angels that Lincoln talked about. So that's a compounding problem that makes it, as Peter said, so wicked. Listen, this isn't going to work or be the right moment for every person in America. Not all of us are ready to listen first to understand. Not all of us are ready to see humanity across differences. But I would humbly submit that I think a lot of us are drawing that line far too deeply into our fellow Americans. the circle of people that we are seeing as deplorable or irredeemable or un-American is laughably large, to be honest. How can a country move forward together without large shares of the country that voted a certain way, that believes a certain way, that has beliefs that you might think are insane, but are sincerely held for them? At some point, for me, Jesse, it becomes a pragmatic issue. We have to move forward together as this United States of America. And when I hear, comments like that from your viewer, which are totally understandable, I've started asking, what's your end game? What are you suggesting? And I've shorthanded the responses to delusion, doom, duck, and dash. So I hear some folks saying, we have just got to somehow, by electoral victory, by the battle of ideas, we've got to just exterminate the values and the perspectives that we find so abhorrent. We are just going to vanquish them and their ideas. I frankly think that's delusional. It's just not going to happen in these United States. Other folks don't share the hope that Peter and I have. They think we're irrevocably destined to another violent civil war. I'm not sitting back and letting that happen. You've also got a lot of us, including, I'm sure, well, maybe less so those who are watching your program, Jesse, but who are ducking down, who are saying, you know what, all this stuff happening nationally, I can't handle it. I'm going to hunker down with my family, with my closest friends, and hope for the best. And then finally, it's just become uncanny, the number of people who have a dash plan, another place on the planet that they're planning to go as things get worse. If I can, Jesse, I'd love to circle back to something that Peter shared and you talked about, and the importance of these other social sectors. It is fantastic that there are hundreds of organizations plus thousands of community groups bringing folks together across differences. But as we well know, we're spending a lot of our time not necessarily engaging with these nonprofits. We're in our faith communities, we're in our workplaces, we're in our classrooms. So it's absolutely critical, and one of the key strategies of the Bridging Divides movement, as defined by the Bridging Movement Alignment Council, is that we push forward the will and the skill to bridge these divides in those sectors such as business, faith, education, and politics, that we mobilize into those spaces and into the local communities Peter talked about, and through national campaigns. I want to credit business. National businesses are supporting Bridging Divides. They're supporting the movement in some cases by investing in our collective campaigns, such as National Week of Conversation and Meeting of America. Pilot partners for Meeting of America, which is one of our collective, large-scale, ambitious endeavors, include Walmart, Target, McDonald's, Harley-Davidson, Dick's Sporting Goods, Boston Beer, and Petco. So folks are seeing it where they are and are beginning to look for that way out.
Let's get some of our viewers into this conversation. We'll start with Ephraim, who's calling from San Antonio, Texas, on the Democrat line. Ephraim, good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Good morning, America. As I said, my name is Ephraim, born in Amazonia. There's so much extremism in politics of today, and there's a difference between the political parties, and let me show you. In the Democratic Party, the extremists, or the folk considered extremists, like the Maxine Waters, they are not in leadership, national leadership. But you go to the Republican Party, the extremists are in leadership. Take Trump. Trump, to most Americans, is an extremist. And that's why the politics is taking this direction. Let me illustrate this. He called the protesters to Washington, and we saw what they did. Maxine Waters may say all she needs, all she wants to say. She's in a wing that she's not in leadership. I'm not going to be convened to Washington, D.C. by Maxine Waters. But Trump did, and we all saw what happened. Even though they continued to tell us people were just touring. This is ridiculous. Thank you.
So, Peter, I'll ask you this question. How do we deal with what happened on January 6th when we talk about polarization in this country?
Yeah, I think it has to be dealt with at different levels. Obviously, Congress and the courts are currently addressing it. There at this point been multiple people involved arrested, some of them convicted. The recent indictments against Donald Trump and some of his colleagues are certainly related to some of this. So I think there has to be sort of legal remedies that take place and that run their due course. And ideally, there has to be some sources of information about that process that are less weaponized and politicized. That's a big problem here, of course, is that you have these judicial processes taking place, but then you have news or supposed news that represents them or misrepresents them and weaponizes them for political purposes. So I'm very concerned with how some media forces weaponize this, information just basically to get attention for their news source and also for their candidates. So it has to happen at that level. But, I want to bring it back down to, us as individuals, because we can't wait for the government to fix this. We really have to mobilize. And I want to just share a brief story, which is that about a year ago, I wrote this book, The Way Out, which is, basically offers 5 ideas from science that have been proven useful in trying to break through, feelings of hate and contempt and enmity for others, particularly for other groups. But I was concerned that, people don't read books very often anymore. And so we wanted to try to get it out there. So basically, I and a group of my former students and colleagues spent about a month really trying to do this, trying to live it. And Pearce and I wrote a series of articles that we published in Time magazine. I think it was starting last fall sometime, a series of 4 or 5 articles that we published, which document how you can do this in your life. And one of the things I did to walk my talk is, I'd become estranged from a neighbor of mine who lives in my building. I live in New York City. I knew him to be a good man and a good father and a good grandfather, but he started to talk about his politics to me, which were very extreme in my view and very different and sort of off-putting to me. So for about a year, I just didn't talk to him. We sort of, retreated to our corners. But I decided last summer, can't do this. This is part of the problem. And so I reached out and I said, hey, would you go for a walk with me in the park one day? And, after some back and forth, he said, sure. And so we walked together and he talked about who he is and where he came from and why the political values on the right really resonate with him. And then I talked about where I came from, and we found some areas that we have common ground. And we basically allowed each other the space to talk without attacking or interrupting. And it was a really good first step, right? I have to say I was nervous to do it. I was sick to my stomach before I met with him, but it was a very satisfying experience, particularly walking outside. This is one of the things we find from science, is that if you reach out to people who you have differences with and go for a walk, ideally side by side outside. There are neurological things that happen that connect you, which is great. But ultimately, we sort of better understood each other. Did we solve the problems? Did I move him away from his party? Absolutely not. But it did introduce some more nuance in our understanding of each other. And we've met since then and continue to talk. And he sends me articles and I send him articles. So we've reestablished a relationship of civility, even though we differ politically. That's what we all have to do. We have to find ways to do that and have the courage to step up and try to do that, even though it may make us anxious.
Pearce, I'll aim this question towards you. I can't show this tweet on screen, but I want you to address what this person was just talking about. The person writes, these people talk about toxic polarization as though it's some organically created force that sprung out of nowhere. It's been created and facilitated by highly paid professionals who are working on behalf of politicians and corporations. They simply refuse to address that. We do know that there are some people who profit off of polarization. How do you combat people who do this as a business for a living? Even though the rest of us don't seem to like the polarization, they push it to make profit. How do we fight that?
Your viewer is speaking to, as Peter already cited, Amanda Ripley in her book, High Conflict, Conflict Entrepreneurs. And my friend David Brooks, writing in The Atlantic last week, talked about the many different stories that you alluded to, Jesse, to explain what he called the rise of hatred, anxiety, and despair. He broke down the technology story, the sociology story, the demographic story, the economic story, and then David really leaned into the moral story, the idea that we inhabit a society in which people are no longer trained in how to treat others with kindness and consideration. But of course, your viewer is absolutely right. Look, there are some national influencers and conscious forces who call us toward social cohesion and collaboration. And there are others who stir up our worst instincts. They're sowing distrust, they're sowing dehumanization for their own personal gain. Now, personally, I'm looking for leaders who put America and their neighbors above themselves. But first, I'm looking in the mirror. What can I do to create a healthier culture in my family, in my community, in my country? That is how change will happen. Our leaders respond to incentives, and we have got to give them better ones.
All right. Let's go back to our phone lines, and let's start with Joe, who's calling from West Plains, Missouri on the Republican line. Joe, good morning.
Hi. Hello. You guys don't understand human nature at all. That tweet was really good, or that text, whatever. That guy was right on, I'll tell you. What makes us mad is government, their policies, their executive orders. That wasn't laws passed. I don't want executive orders from anybody, okay? That's what makes us mad. You guys don't understand human nature. You're never going to change me. January 6th, they didn't do enough damage. You guys are sissies. You can't handle reality of the big cities and the way people act. I'm from the city of Chicago for 60 years. I'm a tough guy from the street. You guys are sissies. You're hurt about everything.
All right, well, I'll let y'all address that however you like.
Well, let me say that I was born in Chicago, and I was born in the late 60s.
Yes.
At a time of great tumult in Chicago, where there were violent protests, anti-war protests. There was the Democratic Convention was there. We had Mayor Daley, who oftentimes attacked some of these protesters. It was ugly. And that's the context I grew up in too, as well. It's not that we're not, well, first of all, I'm a psychologist. I study human nature, and I study particularly human conflict. And so I've spent basically 40 years of my life trying to understand this. So I have to disagree with the caller that we don't understand human nature. I think Pearce and I spend a lot of time trying to understand human nature and trying to appeal to the better side of humans. It's not that we don't recognize that there aren't intentional conflict entrepreneurs that are really doing everything they can to sort of gin up the public, get them angry, mobilize them for their cause. There's a plenty of that. It's also a fact that this pattern, this runaway train we're on in terms of political divisions, it's been happening since the 1970s. And there's no one individual that's caused that, right? It's not Donald Trump. It's not the left. It's not, it's a constellation of things that happens. Sometimes people intentionally play this, including major media organizations, including Facebook and some of the major social media platforms that really prey on our outrage and try to keep us addicted to their interfaces so that we pay attention to them. So there are bad actors that are out there. So my question is, if the government can't help us, again, I don't look to the government to repair all of this. I don't think the government can. I think the government can help repair governments. They can try to depolarize and solve problems in government. But I also think that we as human beings, as neighbors, as family people, as members of a community, there's a ton that we can do. And I think it's irresponsible not to accept that responsibility and do what you can to bring the hate down so that we can get back to solving important problems.
Pearce, anything to add?
Absolutely. I tell you about the human nature that gives me hope, that I see happen every day from coast to coast through these many heroic organizations who are not resigned to doom. for the United States of America. And that hope comes from seeing it happen, from seeing Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs cross their lines of difference, spend a little time together, see humanity in each other, identify some shared values, and work together to fix things they broadly agree are broken. You know, Peter, as he said, has deeply studied this, but I think we all see it, I hope, every day in our lives, that when we see that human, we see that person, not just a position, not just a vote, something happens. It's how we wired. I think it's how God made us. And I also want to take the opportunity, if I can, Jesse, when we're talking about government, to give us a little more hope. Peter already touched on some of the things happening in government. There's bridging divides happening among political leaders. I want to talk about some in state legislatures, in Congress, and among governors, starting with the heroic efforts by a couple state legislators here in North Carolina. Representative Caleb Rudow, a Democrat, and Representative Kevin Crutchfield, a Republican, have decided they're going to tackle the problem together. They're not going to sit back and watch the toxicity poison their public service. Now, it's really important here to note, because I'm sure certainly your last caller and others may be thinking, that's really cute, that's really nice. I bet it's a couple squishy centrists. I can tell you they're not. Caleb and Kevin are not centrist. They both fight vigorously for what they believe in, but they don't attack the people who oppose them. They've hosted bipartisan happy hours, golf events, and even a sing-along. But this is my personal favorite idea. Caleb and Kevin are working on organizing a bipartisan parachute jump. I'm really hoping to be invited. These legislators recognize, as Caleb told me when we chatted yesterday, that the key is creating more and more of what he called these moments, just these moments of being human together. You know, politicians define their own political interest to champion common ground and depolarization. That's patriotic courage if I've ever seen it. And such efforts in legislatures across the country are supported by Listen First coalition partners, such as the National Institute for Civil Discourse, Millennial Action Project, and Braver Angels. More briefly, let me touch on Congress and governors. To see which officials are making a positive impact in Congress and beyond, I recommend checking out the Common Ground Scorecard by our friends at Common Ground Committee. The current leading scorers are Republican Congressman Don Bacon and Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips, who both earn a 104. I was looking at the scorecard recently and was really impressed by Republican Mike Lawler. He's a freshman rep from New York. That's a person putting his country above scoring points for himself. Another freshman member I see putting country over parties, Democrat Jeff Jackson from North Carolina. The scorecard also now includes presidential candidates. And Peter earlier talked about the work of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Another awesome coalition partner, Convergence, directly supports those efforts towards collaboration in Congress, such as those generated by the Select Committee. And I heard you in your last hour, Jesse, talking about Spencer Cox. Our Bridging Divides movement is blessed to have a bold champion in Utah Governor Spencer Cox. He was just elected chairman of the National Governors Association last month and is focusing his chairmanship on an initiative called Disagree Better. And among other activities, bipartisan pairs of governors are recording videos together, modeling and encouraging healthy conflict. So there is hope, even within our bodies right now, of political leaders. And to underline what Peter continues to say, it starts with us. It starts with me looking in the mirror.
Let's go back to our phone line and let's talk to Keno, who is calling from Lakeland, Florida, on the independent line. Keno, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Praise be to C-SPAN for addressing this important issue for the whole nation. Now, I want to find common ground with some relatives I have. I see Trump as a dangerous man for democracy. My family sees him, some of my family members that I love dearly, and they're good people, and they see him as a political hero. Now, I understand how people perceive differently because when I was 12 years old, I have three brothers that we were playing with a ball, and I said, let's get that red ball, and they said, no, it's a green ball. And that left me confused. Why were they perceiving so differently? Later, it turned out all three of my brothers are colorblind. I am not. So that helped me understand. Now, but so for the future, Mr. Trump may go by the wayside at some point, but these people that support Trump, we have to understand. I want to understand my family members. Is there psychological studies of these people? Are they confused by modern life, or do they have a complete lack of faith in modern government? But psychologically, there's one book by 27 psychologists talking about Trump's defects, mental defects. Is there any book that studies his followers and their mental conditions so that I can get better along with my family and so on? There should be a book that analyzes the psychology of Trump supporters. If it doesn't exist, does it exist, or what do you think of this?
All right, we'll start with you, Peter. What do you think?
Yeah, well, again, I applaud Hino's courage and interest in trying to stay connected, even under difficult times with deep misperceptions of one another. Yeah, there's been a fair amount of good research on this, and the reality is that you can't basically put Trump voters into one box. There are different reasons why different people or groups of people support Donald Trump. For a lot of people in this country, it really has come down to a sense that the government doesn't work. I mean, one of our callers had expressed this, earlier. The government doesn't work. It left me behind. It doesn't serve me. The elites that are, in charge of everything from Hollywood to, Congress, are distanced from me and don't really care about me and my family and my life. And they're feeling a sense of hopelessness around this country. I mean, the sort of anxiety and depression and suicide ideation in this country has been growing for decades. People feel a sense of despair and they feel that they're being left behind. There's a rage to that. And when you feel that kind of contempt or despair, you do look for heroes that are just going to break it up. And that's what they see. Well, some see in Donald Trump is someone that just will take on anybody, use anything at his, is available to him to achieve his objectives and break things up. And there's something about that feels right when you feel that the system you're in is fundamentally flawed and unfair. And, and of course, politicians understand that, they weaponize that message, and that's part of why this is such a difficult dynamic. But I do, to break through. But I do think it's very important to understand that there are a lot of different reasons why different groups support Donald Trump. And, the best way to understand it, I think, is to, not in a hostile or contentious way, but perhaps pick a member of your family that you've had a positive history with in the past and ask them to take a walk with you. But if you're going to do this, the objective should not be to, shame them or attack them, but it should be just to listen. If you really want to understand, you have to sort of say, can you explain to me why you support this candidate or why you're angry at the government? Can you explain it to me? That question, research has found, opens people up to telling their stories and oftentimes coming to their own sense of doubt and confusion. That's what happened when I walked with my neighbor. Is I let him talk for about 20 minutes as we walked, and he had started with a lot of talking points that came from Breitbart, and Fox News. But then eventually, as I just listened and didn't challenge or attack him, I just listened and clarified, he basically came to his own doubts and his own confusion and his own regrets about his party because they're there. And so you have to give them the space to explore those and feel safe enough to explore those. And that helps us understand that, there isn't certainty on any side here. And so that would be what I would recommend to start out. There are good books that I can recommend. We can put that on the website, but I would recommend you start with conversations where you're really trying to understand them and you allow them the time and space to fully explore their own doubts and confusions about their own side.
Pearce, any other tips that you can think of besides going for a walk and asking them to explain to you what they're thinking? Any other tips?
That is a great one. And, it'd be inconsistent with my mission to call out any of my fellow Americans, even presidents and former presidents. I'm calling all of us in to healthier behaviors and norms that will make America stronger. In terms of tips, I want to applaud that gentleman for beautifully demonstrating for all of us exactly the kind of practices and norms that will get us there. He's extending grace, right? He's curious. My favorite 3 tips for all of us to practice in our daily life are listen with curiosity, speak from your own experience, and connect with respect. While I'm at it, let me give all of the viewers some great first steps for everybody watching after you've gone on that walk that Peter recommended. I think folks should follow Listen First Coalition Partners Starts With Us on social media to see some really uplifting and empowering posts on overcoming extreme division. Folks ought to go to Resetting the Table and watch the short film Purple. You can get news from across the spectrum at all sides. Check out the topical conversation guides at Living Room Conversations and chime in on their great new question of the week. And finally, you can sign the Listen First pledge. I will listen first to understand. But again, each one of us, starting right after this show, can make a more intentional effort to listen with curiosity, to speak from your own experience, and to connect with respect.
Let's go back to our phone lines and let's talk to Paula, who's calling from Pensacola, Florida, on the Democrat line. Paula, good morning.
Good morning. I agree with everything that they've been saying, and I have many friends that are Republican and Democratic, and we get along fine. Once in a while we'll, have a little debate, but it's never heated or anything like that. Now, my nephews are a totally different story. I have 2 nephews, and my one nephew will come in and say, oh, Biden's done this and this, and I say no, and I don't even get to explain myself. He gets up and calls me a commie and walks out my house. So that's what I'm dealing with, amongst other things, being in Florida. But I think that we need to put more, I'm going to say the R word, regulations on what these politicians put out on their T-shirts, on their merchandise, all their merchandise. I mean, there's some stuff that I've seen on the streets that would be, I don't know, to me is obscene. I'm not even going to repeat what I've read. I mean, they're that bad. And I think that being a politician, they should have some type of a regulation regulating what they can put on T-shirts.
Pearce, I'll aim that toward you. First of all, do you agree with the caller and think there should be more regulation of what politicians say? But second of all, I want to bring up something that she brought up in her conversation. Is there an age gap in toxic polarization? And is there a regional difference for toxic polarization in the United States? And I want both of you to address that part of it.
Great question, Jesse. Personally, I think regulating speech is an extremely slippery and dangerous slope. I think, as I touched on earlier, that we are drawing these circles of people that we don't want to hear from, that have nothing to offer us, people whom we should exclude from listening with curiosity and connecting with respect, way too big, just ridiculously large, in a way that is unsustainable for what I believe is a great experiment in the United States of America. I think when we have ideas put out there and a healthy, non-demonizing competition of those ideas, we can get there. We can turn down the heat and find a way forward together. So I wouldn't go that far in terms of regulation. I think at this moment, again, our larger problem are the number of voices we're shutting out of our lives, either by real action or just by passive action, just refusing to listen and engage with those kind of ideas. But again, always circling back to hope. We've got this Bridge Building Innovation Showcase that's coming up in October. It's co-created by Joe Bubman of Urban Rural Action with other coalition partners. And to your point, Jesse, about what's happening across the country and regional differences, There's studies out there that show folks are more or less outraged in different areas of the country. Certainly, as we get older, we can tend to get a little more stuck in our ways. A fresh perspective from some of our younger generation says, what are y'all doing? This doesn't seem like it's going to work. So there's a lot of hope there in the students who have joined chapters of Bridge USA in college and high school campuses across the country. But this Bridge Building Innovation Showcase is celebrating those who are navigating those divides, generational, political, and racial differences where they are in their communities. You can discover the work of those local heroes at listenfirstproject.org. And I'd also highly recommend checking out really inspiring projects happening coast to coast, supported by New Pluralist as part of their Healing Starts Here.
Peter, is there regional and age differences when it comes to toxic polarization?
Well, so what's interesting and concerning is that for a period, there has been big sort of rural-urban differences. But what we've been seeing more recently is even within major cities, you have neighbors, red neighbors and blue neighbors moving away from the other group and moving closer into their own groups, into these clusters. I'd heard a statistic that the midterm elections showed that something like 90% of the precincts, which are sort of smaller geographic locations in the country, were either more pure red or pure blue, and fewer purple. In other words, there are fewer precincts where you have balances of both Republicans and Democrats. That's concerning when we physically move away from each other, and that's across the country. What's interesting is that some of the places that you might think automatically of as red, for example, Texas has some of the counties that are the most politically tolerant counties in the country, right? That's true in North Carolina. That's true in upstate New York. So it's a complicated set of things. There's hope to be found everywhere. Let me just say one thing that I think really matters, and this is I'm referring back to Paula's conversation with her nephews, is that so much of what's happening is what the media and social media is feeding people, and oftentimes they're feeding them acutely partisan, sometimes disinformation or misinformation. And so one of the things that I would recommend, we have this thing that we call a challenge, which is just a set of exercises that people can do every day for 5 minutes or so, just to start to fight against the trends here, the trends towards hating each other. And one of the main things I would recommend is what I call a news challenge. What I did about a year and a half ago is I intentionally tried to identify 5 people who differ from me fundamentally politically, but who I think are decent, well-informed, smart people who differ from me politically. And I intentionally, when the news breaks, when the indictments come out, or the Supreme Court announces something, or some other policy comes down and immediately becomes weaponized by different aspects of the media, I turn to those people that have different points of view than me, because it's easy for me to turn to the news that I find comforting and reinforcing and, sort of automatic. That's easy for me. And I don't stop doing that. But I also turn to the people who have different political views, who I think are well-informed and decent, right? And that's one way to really challenge our own understanding of what are very complicated issues, which get weaponized and oversimplified. So I would really strongly recommend that as a simple exercise. Paul, you might recommend to your nephews that you all agree to do this. You all agree to try to find some good, intentioned folks on the other side who are either political pundits or news channels or, social media folks, and follow them intentionally to try to reintroduce some kind of nuance into this that can help break the sort of certainty and passions that take place. I would even go so far to say is, one of the things I've done over the past year or so is I'm watching Yellowstone, and I'm watching a show called Dr. Pol, which is just about a veteran that works in, the middle of Trump country in Michigan. Not a veteran, a veterinarian who helps people with animals in the middle of Michigan. These are rural, mostly Trump supporters, but they're just decent human beings that love their animals and appreciate these vets helping them out. And so have anything you can watch that humanizes the other side and that isn't about politics. I mean, Yellowstone, it kind of is about politics, but it gives you a sort of sense of why people see the world very different from you. The more you can do that, the more it will introduce a sort of sense of tolerance and really respect for the dignity of other people.
Let's go back to our phone lines and let's talk to David, who's calling from South Carolina on the Republican line. David, good morning.
Good morning. This is an excellent program. I wish you gentlemen would come back. One thing there's a few things I wanted to bring up. I'll try to be as quick as I can. The psychologist there, you have something very wrong, which I think is part of the root of the problem. The caller that called in is wondering about the mental health of conservatives. His points were 100% ad hominem attacks. And if you interviewed more MAGA people, you would say, and you said something else too, that, and you're trying to rationalize MAGA extremists or something, saying that, well, they don't trust the government, they're not doing what is good for me. Well, this is the whole thing. Conservatives are concerned about the direction of the country. They tend much less to practice ad hominem attacks. They're looking at things like open borders and being compromised to China and Russia, things like that. And also the reversal of JFK's call to do what you can for the country, not what the country can do for you. And even when it comes to the abortion issue, believe it or not, pro-lifers actually care about the unborn baby. And it's a little bit like the statement that Jerry Falwell made famous, which was hate the sin, love the sinner. We don't want to trample on women's rights. We would like to support them through birth and adoption, if possible. They're the victims here. They have an unwanted pregnancy, but we care about the unborn. And you made a very good point, is that people don't read much anymore. And well, for instance, life begins at conception has been established science in the United States and the medical community for over 200 years, but people don't read that. They only hear what they're told to say, but it is science. And one last point to the other gentleman. If you can engage with people that you have a common activity. I'm a musician. I play in big bands, and it's very easy when you have a common love of something to break in gently discussions with people of the other side and have civil discourse. But I think finding a common activity is a good place to start. Say, who wants to stay later and talk about this or that? And I find that the easiest way to understand the minds of liberals who don't know much about science, or even the fact that the first two Civil Rights Acts were Republican acts. And the whole idea was kind of taken by LBJ for votes and with his Great Society, which I think.
I'm going to go ahead and let you answer that first, Peter, since he started out with conversation about you. Go ahead, Peter.
Sure, thank you, David. I appreciate your comments and you're engaging with us. So right, I misspoke if you understood me as referring to mental illness in conservatives as being the problem. I didn't mean to assume that. The trends around mental illness cut across political differences. Younger people are just more anxious, more depressed, and we see higher rates of suicide. Part of what happened, of course, with the opioid epidemic is that corporations targeted poor rural communities where working class people would get injured and then get addicted to opioids. And so we saw death rates skyrocket in these poor communities. And so there is a sense of suffering of different types, but it cuts across political differences. I didn't mean to assume that. And I also would say that I'm not talking about conservatives. I do see major distinctions between conservative Republicans and MAGA Republicans. I think there's a very different belief system and a very different sort of value system operating there. So those are important internal group differences that I think we have to sort of acknowledge and talk about. The same happens on the left with progressives. You have much more extreme progressives and much more moderate progressives, and they have oftentimes very different views on policies. I will, though, really recognize and celebrate your idea of common activities. I think that's critical. I think it's really important. And one of the things, one of the shout outs I want to make is that the group Convergence and other groups, the Rockefeller Brothers, have been bringing together volunteer organizations across the country, the YMCA, the International Rescue Committee, the Habitat for Humanity, all these groups that have volunteer groups and that do good things in communities. And what they've been doing is talking with them about, are there ways that you can intentionally bring people together who differ politically or differ racially or religiously to continue to do what you're doing. And that's proven to be a very important thing, because these are just people trying to help, right? Or trying to engage with their community in ways. And these organizations are trying to be thoughtful about, how do we do this in ways that really best capitalizes on bringing these different people together in service of the common good. I think that's a brilliant strategy. And it really speaks to what you're talking about, which is focusing on common activities.
Pearce, last words, because we only have about a minute left.
I so appreciate the point made there about finding that common activity.
I think, unfortunately,
example I heard just yesterday in talking to a rocket on the shelf. Said, "You like rockets? I like rockets." And now they're doing a bipartisan exploration of a drone program for high school students. So, David, you're exactly right that is the key. What is that thread? What is that common ground? Jesse, we could spend every Washington Journal program from now until the end of the year talking about how we got here and pointing fingers and casting blame. And a lot of it would probably be correct. But I don't see that that's how we get out of this toxic vortex. I think we've all got an urgent choice to make. We're going to keep fighting our fellow Americans, or we're going to fight for America. There is a way out of toxic division. And each one of you watching this program has a powerful role to play right where you are.
Well, we'd like to thank Pearce Godwin, founder and CEO of the Listen First Project, and Peter Coleman, director of the Columbia University Mordorch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and author of The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank
you so much.
Coming up next, we're going to keep this conversation going. We're going to have on with us Kathleen Hall Jameson, director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania. She'll be here in studio to discuss how civics education can heal political divisions. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
During the 2022